Hello, friends. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are going to talk about everything design, and we have Shannon with us. Shannon has a background in product design, and she has worked with companies like Postman, Gatsby JS, and Build Better as senior product design consultant. And she has worked in domains of SaaS and developer tools. Apart from that, she has a previous background in teaching instructional design, and she's passionate about like songwriting and creative aspects like poetry and even spirituality. So welcome to the pod, Shannon. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Anurag. How are you doing?
I'm great. So today we'll be more talking about things like how do people incorporate feedback, interpersonal feedback at work, and even feedback on the product. So just wanted to start off with like a common topic amongst designers about how does one process feedback at workplace, when because often designers are very attached to their works, and with external feedback sometimes there's this problem of inner critique as well. So how do we make sure that that inner critique also helps us in growing?
Sure. Yes, I'm happy to talk about that. So something I've been thinking about recently is batching when you listen to feedback and also filtering the feedback that you listen to. So, for example, if you had a constant stream of feedback all day long and you were just had like design critiques all day long. You had a flood of user feedback all day long, and you were thinking of everything you could improve or everything you're doing wrong. You wouldn't have any time to change anything or implement anything. Um, and it's too much information to process and interpret. And so batching feedback would mean setting aside time where you look at feedback. And yeah, so kind of having like a regular cadence of feedback. So one example is I used to watch user screen recordings of user sessions, like anonymous recordings that came from a product called Full Story. And I would watch them on Friday afternoons. And it was kind of fun because work is usually a little slow on Fridays. And I would just call it like Cinema Fridays because it was like a nice break from the week. And so it made it a little more fun and also kept it in a specific time frame. So I knew I could give it the attention it deserved, but also not be overwhelmed or have it constantly upsetting the flow of the week. So that's an example. And you mentioned an internal critic, and I'll get more into user feedback in a moment, but um, oftentimes we have like a background of thoughts in our mind that are like, oh, these other designers are so much more skilled than me, so much more advanced, or like they were a developer before and now they're a designer. They know a lot more about developer tools. I don't know. I think other designers
Yeah.
can relate to this.
Right, exactly. And then that's the reason why people always have a question that should I learn to how to code like as a designer? Yeah,
Yeah.
that stems from that.
Yeah. So um, when you batch internal critique for yourself, I think like those thoughts, they're trying to help us. They're like, they see room for improvement. There's a part of yourself that knows that. But it also is important to like remind yourself that progress takes time. And so just like constantly feeling bad about yourself, it doesn't really make sense, like because you can't improve overnight. Sometimes I feel like I'm like, I have to be 1,000 times more skilled at this by tomorrow or else I'll fail. And the truth is that you can provide value and do work that needs to be done if you find the right fit. So like scoping a project so that it fits your skills, or finding a job that what they need is what you can offer, and then just step by step looking for opportunities to progress. I think it helps like calm those inner critical thoughts, because then you know, okay, I am progressing, but it's at like a reasonable, achievable rate.
Right. I generally think of it is like I'm a facilitator. So, for example, like a cook. For example, if I made something for you and you didn't like it, that's a feedback for me. And then
Hmm.
it's not for me actually. It's for the dish that I made. So I'm a
Yeah.
facilitator. So my job is to make sure that I make the dish that you like as a
Hmm.
consumer. So
Yeah.
that sort of detachment is something like we have to cultivate a bit, because like right from the start we we grow up doing giving tests, right? So in tests we either like pass or we get a grade. So sometimes that uh, thinking trickles into our work as well. So we think of our work as also as a, whether did get a good grade or not. So
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. That detachment from
right.
the outcome of your work means that you can accept feedback and improve. And getting frequent feedback can really help a lot with that too, because if you
Hmm.
work on something for 3 months and then you find out it didn't work,
Right.
it's a little harder to feel detached than it is if you design
Hmm.
something and 2 days later you get feedback from your coworkers or
Hmm.
a couple of open source users or something, then you're like, oh, okay, I got feedback fast enough that I can change without investing a lot of time yet.
Right.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, how is in this context, how is your process generally? Because you have worked with tools like developer tools like Postman, and even Gatsby is fairly technical in terms of functionality. How do you approach like technical projects and scoping of technical projects so that you don't get like you don't waste a bunch of time going in the wrong direction?
Yeah, sure. So, um, one example I can share is the plugin library at
Mm,
Gatsby. So, when I started working at Gatsby, we had a README file in GitHub with a list of hyperlinks to plugins that
mm,
open source community members had made, and it was starting to get long.
mm,
So that was the first problem, was searchability. Can people find the plugins that already exist? And we had a lot of other goals too, like how do we help people learn how to make plugins for everyone
mm,
who wants to? Um, should we feature certain plugins? Are we going to have ratings or measurements of reliability or how up to date the plugins are? And so I talked to the co-founders a lot, and basically just I think jobs to be done can really help. So you can write out
mm,
all the jobs to be done and then look at them and decide which one has the most impact on
mm,
users and is the lowest effort. And that's usually what I go with as the priority. So high impact, low effort. So and so high impact, I think, is when it affects a crucial user flow. So the first one that I decided was most crucial was just we need a searchable library,
mm,
because if we're planning on this expanding where people can make a lot of plugins, then we need like an environment where they feel like they can promote their plugin and people can find it. So yeah, so that's the first thing we did. And then afterwards, I created plugin authoring documentation to help people know how to make their plugins. And um, one of the pieces of that was templates. So when you make a plugin, people need to know how to install it and use it. And so I gave people like a template for here's how to make a README for your plugin. And that was the next step, and there were other phases, but that's something that's
mm.
really helped me when a project seems a little ambiguous or maybe a large scope.
Right, like finding out the most impactful, like 80-20% impact, and then teaming up with like your to do like jobs to be done framework, so that creates like a good scope for that, right?
Yeah, and I think actually sometimes there's not a perfect answer. um
Hmm.
there could have I could have started with the plugin authoring docs, I think, and just figured out a way to share that with users, get feedback on it, and maybe we'd start seeing a lot more people making plugins, and then it would have been okay to
Mm.
reverse the order of those projects. I think it was a little arbitrary in in that particular case. Um, and so in some cases, I think the important thing is just make a choice and just do it,
Hmm.
just so you can get something done. And
Right.
maybe you'll look back and be like, oh, I should have done something else first. But as long as it's a small enough scope and you only spent like, I don't know, a month on it or something, then it's
Hmm.
not as big of a risk. Like your choice of what to do first isn't, it's not
Right.
that risky. It's okay to just have some ambiguity.
Right. I wanted to like know about, okay, for example, if even if you make some choices, so there are certain directions that the product wants to go, and sometimes before putting it out there, you have to take certain choices that, as you mentioned. But some apart from that, we have to make sure that it's also scalable. For example, if I'm making something, the user feedback might go in different directions. So how do you think about flexibility in terms of design, like for especially for something like a complicated dev tool? So like how do we incorporate flexibility in our decisions or even in design?
Yeah, thank you. One thing one thing that I know you and I talked about before that I saw in some of your like brainstorming about what we could talk about was um, how to make sure we don't block advanced users from their workflows. And
Right.
so a couple things I was thinking about were um, no matter how much you talk to users, they still will think of ways that they want to use your product that you didn't anticipate. And so the UI you provide can enable them to like use it however they want. So a couple examples of that would be CSV files for data or raw logs. So let's say you want to give people structured logs and you've designed this way of like showing which things are errors and uh, maybe like pulling all the errors to the top. And then it's always a good idea to also provide the raw logs so that people can explore them in a way that maybe you hadn't anticipated. So that's an example of empowering advanced users to do what they want. And then another example might be providing API, like surfacing a product's API so people can extend it in a way that they want. So, Gatsby's plugin library was one example of that. People wanted to bring in data from anywhere into their website,
Hmm.
and giving them a way to easily create a plugin allowed them to use Gatsby in ways that none of us had even thought of before. So that's one way to I think introduce flexibility into design. Um, Another example I was looking at is honeycomb. It's
Hmm.
a like a way to drill into data about all the user events that are happening on the back end. So like let's say users are going through the checkout flow and they're using coupon codes, the inventory is updating as the system like checks the backend data. And you can, in Honeycomb, you can look at that data in so many flexible ways. So basically all it does is show you like scatter plots with outliers, but it's up to you to decide which parts of the scatter plot you want to like zoom into and filter for. And then it lets you drill down into like the tiniest bits of information. So you'll be like, okay, this part of the process took like 6.7 seconds. Why is that? Okay, there's like 10 little events that occurred inside of that one. It's very nested. And so it's really great for debugging. Um, yeah, those are some examples of flexibility in the UI, I think. And I think there's also examples of how to be flexible in the way you think about design, but I've been talking for a while, so maybe I'll pause there.
No, that's true. Like in general as well. For example, having like a way to provide a file upload instead of filling forms, those are always
Yeah.
better. Like especially if there's like a lot of effort involved in certain things, and it's again again, also like similar to how people see like a mental model, where they are used to seeing certain things in a certain way, and even though your version might be better than like a, instead of a raw JSON you giving a tree, no code tree, sometimes that is something that they are used to see. So that's always helpful, right? Speaking like you mentioned something about, okay, you gathering feedback and even gathering insights about, okay, how the user is interacting with the product. On your LinkedIn you mentioned that like you worked on the onboarding process on Postman, and also there's a common conception, okay, you have to give your customers a first quick win.
Hmm.
So there's this metric that you mentioned, that okay, you reduce the onboarding point by 5 minutes or something like that. So, and it also ties in with your point about, okay, what is the most impactful thing. So can you tell
Hmm.
us about like more about, okay, how was that whole experiment going on, about
Sure.
onboarding and how it went on?
Sure, yes. So the key thing that we found out at Postman was looking for correlation between users' actions during onboarding and whether they were still using Postman 6 months later. And there
Hmm.
were two actions that were correlated pretty clearly, and one was sending at least 5 API requests within a collection. So a collection was a folder where you
Hmm.
could save requests. So we knew those were correlated, and the data analysts figured that part out. And then my job, I considered it to be figuring out why those are correlated. Like, why do the users who do that, why do they want to? And why does that correlate with them sticking around? And for the users who are not doing it, why are they not doing it? Is it because they don't know about it, or they know about it but it's hard to use, or do they not care about it and it's not what they need or want? Um, so that's where usability testing came in. I used userinterviews.com to recruit I think I recruited 8 people and ended up doing 6, like a couple of people canceled. Um, Usability tests to watch them go through Postman onboarding. And I set up this, there's like a way to filter what users they recruit for you. And I tried to find people who had never used Postman before. Um, so that's why I did it. That's why I didn't recruit myself from Postman users, because I wanted to find people who had never used it before. It actually didn't work perfectly. Like, half the people had used Postman before, even though they said in the survey that they had not used it. I wonder if they
Right.
just like forgot, and then they
Yeah,
were like,
they were anchored to, okay, I've seen this one somewhere.
yeah. So that was kind of funny. And yeah, what I discovered was that category of people who there's a category of people who actually want to send a request and save it for later, but they didn't know how to find it very quickly. And so that seemed like a quick win, because it was obviously like a key user flow and job to be done, where they're like, okay, I'm getting onto Postman to quickly test some API requests and see what the response is, like learn what fields it returns to me. And then it was like the homepage had a lot of options on it, so they didn't know how to get there, and it was slow for them to find it. And so that's what I experimented with, was how do I surface that flow to them so they see it right away.
Right. A while back, I attended this conference about SaaS, and then they also emphasize on this same aspect where if you're onboarding someone, you have to make sure that they get something out of the product quickly. Maybe if it's
Yeah.
like if you're creating a ticket, it creates a ticket for you with just minimal effort, so that they get like, okay, this is how it works. So that first step should be very easy to execute. Yeah, and then that same insight ties into your story as well.
Yeah, and it can be tricky to decide what action is like the most rewarding
Right.
first quick win. So I think, like we were talking about before, which is writing down jobs to be done and identifying which ones are crucial, and you can validate that, come up with some hypotheses, but validate it through like talking to as many coworkers as you can, all the sales people, all the customer support people, all your engineering coworkers and PMs, and then also finding users to talk to as well. Community forums are great too, and then data, like looking at what actions are correlated with really active users. And yeah, and then you just have to make your best judgment call of like, okay, this is the one action we want them to experience really fast, and try it out.
Right. Generally, like whenever you are working on a project, how often, when do you generally plan in the life cycle? For example, you are working on a feature, you completed it. Now, there might be, okay, something else that you can work on, an extra feature or something enhancement that you can do yourself as an audit. Like you can just audit yourself, add more functionality, and versus getting some external feedback and improving on current one. So like you have run Gatsby also as a sort of a leader in terms of design, even in Postman. So how do you decide, okay, when do you make that, okay, this is, we need some user feedback from it, versus uh, taking like some internal calls or doing a simple audit?
What do you mean by audit?
For example, you find something and then you reanalyzing and putting your brains to it just to solve, okay, how do I make this easier to do on your own, versus how do you plan to get like user input? Do you get user feedback every time, or do you just make sure that, okay, just I'll just make it easy somehow?
Yeah, I love that question. So the first step I think is just like writing down your open questions that you don't have answers to yet.
Hmm.
So let's say, I don't know, let's say you just shipped a new dashboard or something.
Hmm.
You could write down questions like, how usable is this dashboard? Um, is it valuable? Like, are people willing to pay for it? Um, you might even have something really specific, which is like, maybe you have a little bit of data and you're like, why are people clicking on this part of the dashboard, but then immediately going back to the homepage? They like don't spend any time looking at some sort of detail page. So open questions can then guide how you look for the answers to those questions. So you
Hmm.
might look at one question and say like, oh, I might be able to answer that through reading customer support tickets. And you could just like search with keywords and see if you can answer it. And if not, then if you still haven't answered it, then try the next thing, which might be like, I'll read sales call notes. I'm going to read, I'm going to talk to PMs who used to work on this, or, and eventually, because it does take quite a bit of investment to do primary research where you recruit users and set up usability tests.
Right. Hmm.
Um, so that's why I think like trying to answer the questions as fast as you can help you. By the time you get to talking to users, you've sort of like refined what you already know about them. You're like, okay, now I have a lot of like hypotheses about, so I can empathize with them. And then you like use your time with them really well. Because it can be kind of a bummer to like set up usability tests with users and do all this effort, and then they tell you stuff that you're like, oh, I probably could have figured that out by myself. um,
Right.
yeah. And the other thing you were mentioning, which is like, when do you just not even need user feedback directly? There are times I think where you can trust yourself, because there are some UX fundamental UX principles that are always true, basically. Like,
Right.
users need to know the status of any process. Like if they initiate an action, they click a button, they need to be able to see that there's like a loading state, and then they need to know if it succeeded or failed. That kind of stuff is like, you don't need to ask a user if that needs to happen. You just know, it's part of what we can offer as designers is some knowledge of those best practices. And So yeah, it can be fun to just look at a design and kind of like make a list of test it out yourself even and just be like, oh, I forgot this part, or like, oh, this would be more optimal. Yeah. So
Right.
I think that is completely valid. And it
Hmm.
can be fun to do that.
Definitely, like for example, many times we might realize, okay, I didn't look specifically at this aspect from like this feature from this aspect, okay, and then later on when we are in the critique or when we are in the meeting where presenting, and then we realize, okay, I didn't put this one, this
Mm-hmm.
was shortcoming. So just looking from ourselves also from a third person fresh perspective, taking a
Yeah,
break or two, and then coming back to the design on the next day, that also sometimes helps, like getting a third person point of view.
that's so true. I presenting it to other people or even just like recording yourself talking about a design.
Articulating it right.
Yeah, like I like always immediately recognize like 10 things that I could do differently. Or like I don't know why that helps so much, but or
Right.
writing about it too, like blogging about new features that you're working on. Even just like drafting a blog post, regardless of whether your company has a
Hmm.
blog or is going to post about it, you could just think like, oh, I might make a portfolio project in my own portfolio website someday. And writing a draft can really help you identify gaps
Hmm.
in your thinking process or ways to improve the design.
Right. So, in terms of feedback and then all these decisions related to product and where it's going, even from user, you get all this feedback back and forth, and you also have your internal voice. But even though as a leader, you might have that sort of maturity to take feedbacks head on, not head on, or maybe absorb it, but how do you take that aspect of yours and inculcate that into your team as a leader? You might have work people who don't take feedback that well, so how do you inculcate in your team that aspect?
Um, well, one thing that I've found helpful is in Figma, I put like sticky notes, virtual sticky notes, just like yellow
Right.
boxes under frames, and it can help me track. I write down like my thinking process, so I'll kind of do like FAQs under each one that'll say like, why did we choose a pop-up checklist for onboarding instead of a checklist embedded in the homepage?
Hmm.
And that's what the sticky note says. It has that question and then it has answers to it. So that, because often those answers were like a collaborative thing. Like I'll write down, like, oh, me and this engineer tried it and it didn't work for XYZ reasons. Or like, we looked at these benchmarks and decided that a pop-up checklist was nice because you can pop it up even if you navigate to another page. I think that like writing process then helps me when I'm in like design critiques or presenting something. I feel prepared for questions, um, where people are like, well, why did you do this or why did you do that? And I can sometimes I'll like forget why I made a certain decision, and then I can look through that and think like, oh, this is why I decided that. Or maybe I'll see like, oh yeah, I really haven't thought through that.
Hmm.
Um, and so that culture of being able to articulate the reasons for doing things, I think it makes everybody feel like a little more comfortable and safe. Like it's not a personal, it's not a matter of like just opinions or something. It's actually like something you can reason through. And
Hmm.
if you can write it down, then it's sort of like external to yourself where everybody can discuss the pros and cons of different options without it just being like a personal, um like, well, I think this is better. Yeah.
So that often happens, like if you have made something, okay, this is from this point of view, but then the developer comes, okay, they have a specific use case, and then you have to incorporate that, and you didn't think even about it. So yeah, like writing that down really helps. Like even it's like journaling prompts, right? You learn more about your process when you are writing about from a prompt,
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
right? Generally, like even now, since you have worked on so many user tests also, uh, how do you conduct like a typical user test so that like the user gives you honest feedback? Because that might be a question, like we might be asking leading questions. So what are your general what is the general process about it?
Sure, thank you. So something I have wanted to try and I actually haven't, but think it's worth sharing is I talked to a really experienced UX researcher once, and he said that I mean, I think this works better at bigger companies, but like swapping with another designer where you'd run usability tests for something you did not design. Um, that allows you to tell the user, you're like, I didn't design this, so you cannot offend me. Like somebody else did this. Or if you're doing a usability test for the part of the product that already existed before you got there, then you can tell them, you're like, I don't even know who designed this, so just like tell me like the absolute truth. Um, Another thing to set the stage for users is tell them that they are the expert and that you're there to learn from them. And so that way you're like you're showing that you trust them and value their opinion. And as far as not asking leading questions, I think like just having with you like a list of the types of questions that are really open-ended to ask them. So I usually just write down, if it's a usability test, I'll write down like at the most like 2 to 3 tasks that I want to see them try to do. And I'll just say like, okay, like try to create a new project, and I want to hear your thought process as you're um, looking for that in the UI and trying to do that task. And I'll tell them like, it doesn't, if it's hard to find or you can't figure it out, that is not your fault. That is like the user, it's always the product's fault. So don't be shy about like admitting if you can't find something or are confused. And then as they're going through, if they like forget to talk out loud as much as I would like, then I can just ask them like, why did you click on that? Or what were you thinking when you scrolled down and scrolled back up again? Um, so open-ended questions can really help, like who, what, where, when, why. And then trying to think of what else. And then there's like follow-up questions. So if I say like, oh, why did you scroll back down and scroll back up? And they're like, oh, I was looking for something. Then you can ask, what were you looking for? And they tell you, and you're like, why were you looking for that? So yeah, so I think those are some ways to try to give them the space to really share what they're thinking without being like biased by what you think.
Right. And in this process, how often do you do it? Do you do it in cycles like, okay, I'll gather feedback and then take 2 sprints for implementing that? How is that need for getting user? So it's always there, by the way. But how
Mhm.
is that event getting triggered? Okay, I need some user feedback. Do you do as a cycle, as a routine, or you do it only when certain things are not happening or some, like how often, what were the triggers for you to conduct different user tests that you have done so far?
It's always been on an as-need basis.
Hmm.
So I have done surveys on a cadence
Hmm.
so that I can see like the same survey every quarter or something and look at the trends over time. And sometimes I've had in those surveys, like the last question will be, would you be willing to answer follow-up questions about this? And the people who say yes, I can reach out and set up an interview or a usability test, and like give them swag or something. Yeah, people are always excited about that. So that's the only thing I've ever done on a regular cadence is
Hmm.
kind of that survey and then reviewing those survey results and following up with people. But other interaction, like primary research with users, I've always done just on an as needed basis. So connected to what I was saying before about making a list of open questions. Because sometimes I don't really have any important open questions, and then I don't need to spend the time at that moment. And there's other times where like I'll do some really hard work on understanding users and their jobs to be done and their pain points in a specific flow or area of the product. And then I'll find like we keep working on that area of the product for a while. And I'm like, this UX research is actually like a super strong foundation. We don't need to like keep working on it. I just go back to like a document that I create with a summary and just keep using that for a while. Yeah, so, and then data, I think like it's really funny. So at every job I've ever had, everyone always talks about having like a regular, like let's talk to 3 users a week or something. And for whatever reason, it just never works out. It's
Yeah, that's the copybook example or sort of principle I heard. That's why I asked you, like, how is your routine? Is there even routine required, or is it like whenever you require it, just get some feedback out from outside?
yeah. Yeah, I have created I tried making a UX research kind of group or something that users could join, and I'd just say like, oh, we'll reach out and anytime we're doing usability tests. But then it just it ends up being like doing targeted stuff on an as needed basis has always been the most fruitful. So those
Mm.
lists, like I think users, they always feel generous when you're just like, can I contact you at some point about a usability test? Everyone's going to say, like a lot of people are going to say yes, but then I think like the response rate has been a lot lower for that as opposed to when I do it about a very specific use case and reach out to specific users for a reason or reach out right after they filled out a survey. So yeah, just those general groups haven't worked for me. Maybe they work for other people. Or if you have a big enough volume, like you work at a really big company and you just have like 1 million users or something, then a certain percentage of them probably will respond to
Mm.
requests for usability tests. So I can't speak for every situation, but for what I've experienced, yeah, on an as needed basis has been a great response rate.
Yeah, and a lot of these users might be developers in your case. So, how did you find that needs or interaction of a developer compared to other types of users is different, and how are their needs also different uh, when it comes to interacting with an app?
Sure, yeah. This has been such an interesting evolution for my learning over the years. So I felt so intimidated when I started doing design for developer products. I just
It's a
was,
lot of unlearning rather than uh,
yeah,
yeah, learning.
yeah. It's when my first few, so I'm part of like a Slack community with other designers and PMs and
Mm.
UX researchers, and sometimes I would share like screenshots of my designs just to get some feedback from outside of developer tools, and they're always like, it's so cluttered. And I realized eventually that the needs of developers, the fundamental needs are the same, but the way that you meet those needs in a design can be different. So um, I was thinking about an example. So like Uber, users' questions are like, how fast can a car get me somewhere, and how much which one's cheaper, or which car is big enough? Those are questions with a right and a wrong answer. Like it's one answer. So it's not an
Right.
open-ended question really. Um, and so the UI doesn't need to provide very much data to answer the question. All you have to show about the cars is like their size and the cost and the time estimate for the ride. Whereas for developers, their questions are often pretty open ended. So they're like, oh, what's the best way to optimize my site performance? And that has they're doing much more like exploratory work. And as designers, we may not know the right answer because there might be like 20 different right answers. And so the UI needs to allow them to explore many options. So like we can make some guesses or some hypotheses or make suggestions, but they have to have access to like the raw data or sort of like structured data about all the stuff they're working on.
Mm.
Yeah, so I could probably talk about this forever, but yeah, so I think the fundamental need is the same, where the design should be answering their questions. And sometimes we can answer much more precise things for developers, like how many errors occurred in your website build. That has a specific answer. It's not an open-ended one. Um, but yeah, like how to resolve those errors. That is more open-ended.
Right. So while making any design project or even starting the project, how what is the process about for collaborating with the developers? Because as you mentioned that many aspects of the interface you might not be familiar with. So do you follow any documentation template, or what is the process to get that data in your head so that you can put it on your canvas?
Um, yeah, I think that's something that's so fun about working on developer tools is your coworkers are
Your
under
user.
like they are the users too. um, and so I guess like the two things that have helped the most for me is asking open-ended questions and why questions of my coworkers. So maybe I do a bunch of reading sales call notes, reading customer support tickets, reading existing UX research, and then I come up with a guess or like a more specific question. And so like an example at Postman, creating a collection of requests. I think I asked my coworkers at some point, just on like Slack or something in my squad, I was like, hey, what are some, why do you make collections of requests? How do you decide to put something in a folder? And can you show me some examples of how you name those folders and why you made them? And that's so sometimes I going back to like feeling intimidated, I've really had to learn to overcome my fear of sounding kind of like I'm asking like stupid questions, because they're not stupid questions. It's actually the same as what you would be asking as a designer anywhere, where you want to know from the users, like they are the experts on what their workflows are, and we're, as designers, we're just here to learn. So it's so important to just ask questions, and coworkers are a great source of that. And then I also invite my coworkers to do research and design together. So I'll invite them to usability tests and user interviews to like take notes, and they pitch in on questions when they have them. Sometimes we would just like look at data together, or read customer support tickets or community forums together. And then with designs, usually I would come up with like, do sketching exercises together. And then I would come up with like two or three design options, and we'd get together again to talk about the pros and cons and the feasibility of the different options. And yeah, they just had awesome ideas. It's so fun to work closely with engineers. I've loved that.
Right. And even when you're working with developers, sometimes the suggestions that you get might be too overkill for us to even comprehend firsthand, and then it has to like simmer around, and then it you'll get, okay, this is the concept and this is how it works. So because their requirements are very heavy in data. Okay, I want to get this whole response in one section, and then it has to work in the other way. So overall, I feel like, yeah, working with developers is a good way to just get a hold of the things that you want to work with.
Yeah, yeah, I agree.
Right. In terms of now, since we are, as a designer, we have a bunch of tools at our disposal, and then in recent last 1 or 2 years, we have another tool, a big tool, that is like the AI tool genre. So, how are you leveraging AI tools in design? Um, is there any specific tool that you use on a daily basis to get work done? So, what is your workflow with that?
Um, I haven't used it for visual design as much yet. I know there are things that I could try. I don't know why I haven't. I've used it for writing for sure. There's also quite a few call recording, like transcript AI
Hmm.
tools, so that will convert call recordings into transcripts, and then you can prompt the AI to analyze those transcripts. So Build Better AI, where I did some consulting, does that. There's a tool called Fathom. Dovetail is starting to do that. It's kind of pretty early for them because that isn't their specialty. They're just introducing that. Um, I think that Gong is starting to do that. That's a sales calls platform, but it's pretty expensive. And then what else have I looked at? I think Otter AI and Loom are starting too, but I'm pretty sure at Loom it was also, it's kind of like a paid feature for a lot of
Hmm.
places. Um, so that's interesting to explore and see how it can save time with analyzing what you're hearing from users.
Hmm.
And you can honestly, you can just paste a whole bunch. Like, let's say you got like 100 user quotes that you've pulled out of just different random places. You could just paste that into like Chat GPT and ask it to create a summary. Just be like, give me 5 bullet points to the top 5 pain points, and make the headers bold and include one quote per pain point.
Right.
So yeah, those have actually like worked pretty well. It takes some playing with the prompts to get it to do a good job.
Hmm.
And then like usually that's just a starting point for me. I don't take it as like a final
Hmm.
answer, but I'm like, oh, that's an interesting perspective. And then I go back and reread stuff myself and scan and edit the summary. So yeah, I actually have used it a fair amount.
Right. Yeah. Thinking about it more from a assistance point of view rather than like getting the idea straight away, because sometimes you just want a casual bouncing back of ideas. Okay, what do you think about this, or some argument so that you can think about more deeply about certain aspects.
Oh,
Uh,
I just remembered something too. So ChatGPT lets you record your voice or record sound.
yes.
And I actually was doing that for a while where I would just talk out loud about different design options I was thinking of, where I was like, oh, when users are creating a project, they probably want to do this. So here's two design options. Here's why I'm thinking I should do the first one. And then like you don't even have to prompt it for anything. It just like acts like it's a person responding to your thoughts. I would say it's very validating all the time though. It'll like almost never tell you that you're wrong. It's always just
Right.
like, wow, that's an interesting
Great.
idea. And like it sounds like you've really thought through it. And
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, that happens a lot because it's like a general purpose model. So sometimes you have to make sure, like, I think that gets solved if you go into the setting and put custom instruction that you don't have to agree with me all the time. If you feel that,
Oh, really?
yeah, so if you feel that, okay, like I need critical feedback for my work, then you have to be critical. But if you only find like something like that, and then that instruction, it takes it like as the main instruction for its behavior.
Okay. I didn't know there were settings like that. That's
Yeah, and then
interesting.
this one more hack where you just put a line where you say, use ums and ahs and take pauses when you're talking. So it feels like you're literally talking, because it takes ums and ahs and then pauses, so that it feels like you're talking to somebody who's like casually chit chatting with you.
Oh, that's interesting. Thanks for those hacks. That's yeah, I didn't know that.
Right. So what? So you mentioned that you are consulting an AI product also. So what do you think about like future of products in general when AI is like deeply embedded into everything? How does it change an existing experience, or how should a designer think about in when something like an
Mm,
AI feature is getting introduced into their product?
yeah, that's a great question. So everybody's putting like chat interfaces into their products.
Right.
I listened to a podcast recently with Jacob Nielsen, the like and then Nielsen Norman Group founder
Mm.
guy. And he said the AI that we see in products now is the worst AI design that we're going to see for the rest of our careers. So I think what he's saying is like chat is not the durable, scalable option. It's really helpful for some things, and it's also does not take advantage of the full power of AI. So I recently worked on a side project with my husband, actually, which is a smart grocery shopping list app. So you put in a recipe, and then you can take pictures of stuff that's in your kitchen. And like image processing is good enough, image identification, that it can like read the labels of, like, I took a picture of like 15 spice jars, and then it records that those are in my kitchen. So then when I make a recipe, it tells me like, you already have these spices, so it excludes them from the shopping list, and then it generates a list that's organized by grocery store section. So like, here's fruits and vegetables, here's canned food, and that's all AI, but you wouldn't even know it if you're using the app. Like, it doesn't say that AI categorized things
Right.
by section. So I would say as a designer, just dream up the best user flows you can imagine. Just like, oh, what if a user could get this outcome? Or what if they, yeah, what if like this part of the flow was just, they got to skip that one step? Or, that's the same design thinking we've already been doing, but then we
Mm.
really need to find engineers who are experts in what AI can do, because then they can identify like, oh, actually we can do that now because of AI. So your product might not even say like something AI-ish is happening. It'll just work better.
Right. Like I think AI would eventually go to a place where like it actually it has been already there, because earlier in Amazon we used to get recommendations, and those were also powered by neural networks, but nobody like noticed it because it was
Yeah.
recommendation. Now that
Yeah.
we have somebody talking, like an AI talking, we feel that okay, it's like artificial intelligence, right? And also I think in this aspect, right, when you're talking to a developer in terms of implementation, what I realized that a lot of prompting also helps in getting the feature out, because sometimes even integrating, it's just like a block of custom instruction that they put on top of the feature, and then you have to come up with the instructions. Okay, it should work like this, and then for the AI it's like a simple text instruction at the back end.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, for a designer, I think that also helps if you're just experiment playing with AI, just okay to see okay how it works in terms of when I say something like this versus this. So how to
Mm-hmm.
give better instructions is like, I think your background as an instruction designer would be impeccable for like writing custom instructions.
You mean
Yeah,
like
you
to
should-
help me, like to help me think through my own stuff while I'm like
right.
chatting with an AI?
But
Yeah.
right, like if you want to just get something AI to get something done for you, you can take that instruction design principles to just craft like a really good instruction that it follows to the T.
Yeah, it's interesting what I've definitely like seen my own limitations in that regard too, though. Like sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm having to learn to write things that are much more precise, that like it can't mess up, because I have like a literature background. There's always like
Hmm.
metaphors and similes and symbols, and so I think that's
Right.
sort of the way I think, and then I've had to learn to be like extremely like
Templatized.
precise. Yeah. But yeah, it's cool. There's like a lot of prompt kind of
Yeah.
like libraries out there now, where you can read what other people are doing, and get some ideas from that. But I agree, it can help you think through your own thought process and get a lot more like concise
Hmm.
and precise with how you're thinking about things.
Yeah. This was a great discussion, Shannon. We dive deep into how to take personal feedback, how to take feedback at work, how to collaborate better, and when and how to like conduct all the user research and usability testing. So thank you so much for your time. Do you want to share anything with the audience? Is there anything that you want link to be shared or something?
Oh, a link. Yeah, I could share my portfolio. I've got some blog posts on there about signing developer tools and some portfolio projects. One of my blog posts actually has like a basically like a template of a UX research checklist and a UX research summary that I'm sharing so people can maybe like save time from all the trial and error I had to try.
Sure.
Yeah, and on LinkedIn, I always love to follow other people that are designing developer tools or technical tools so we can learn from each other. So yeah, I can share both of those links.
Yep, that would be done. And thanks once again for your time and for all the nuggets of knowledge that you shared today. Thanks for coming.
It was really fun. Thanks, Anurag.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll stop the recording now.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, this was a great discussion. Like we really went with
It
the
was really
flow.
fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
appreciate it. It's I've